Hello, you're listening to INTERZONE Pod. My name is Gareth Jelley. I'm the editor of INTERZONE, and today I'm talking to Aigner Loren Wilson. Hello, Aigner. Thank you very much for coming on today and talking to me.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to sort of start off. You are a writer, you're an editor, and you also review. You have these sort of different sort of aspects to what you're doing. How kind of in what order did those sort of come about, and how did they come about?
Thanks for that question. It's a really good one. I think I started writing first, and I kind of got into poetry for a while. And then from poetry, I moved into fiction because it made more money and it had more venues for me to publish in. And I wanted to make writing a career. So I was like, all right, fiction is where it's at. And so I started writing fiction, but I wasn't any good at it, as many of us are when we start writing fiction or writing at all. So I wasn't any good at it. So I was like, all right, let me like pump my brakes. I'll do some exercising, like writing exercising and kind of learning about craft. But I'll also start kind of getting into editing and realizing how to talk about story and how to work with story and diagnose story problems.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started learning about that. And then I fell into first reading or slush reading for Strange Horizons. And I was with them I think I've been with them since 2015 or 2014. So a while now. And that started giving me a lot more like actual experience of like talking about stories and kind of learning more about them.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was doing that, I was like, well, I want to like, talk about this with someone, but I didn't have like many people that I could talk to, or like I wanted to talk too much. But I was like, I'll just start writing reviews. And at first I did it just on a blog. And then I started pitching it to places and people were like, yeah, sure. We'll pay you to write about this thing, a book or movie, or I think for a while I even did some like horror audio, like records and albums and stuff like that, and reviewed those for a couple of places. But it kind of all just snowballed from like me loving story and wanting to understand story, and just like, I don't know, loving writing about it so much and talking about people.
Mm-hmm.
And it just kind of like all built together into this web of all these things that I now work on.
Well, that kind of leads into the next question in a way, because I kind of wonder, you mentioned you were reading at Strange Horizons for a long time, and how, what sort of things took you by surprise when you found yourself reading a lot of, submissions, and just generally, how did that sort of reading process, educate you as a writer?
Yeah, another solid, really good question. I think the first thing I realized was that there's a lot of the same story that comes through.
Mm-hmm.
That like I even found a couple of my stories, and that's kind of like a joke that I have with some of my other editors over at Strange Horizons. We'll see like stories that come through, be like, I wrote this story. Like I know this story. Like this is one of my stories. How did they find this? But it's just like how surprising it is that there's just like people writing very similar stories, if not like we've even found stories with like really similar titles, and like there's like weird and this is like before the whole AI thing. So it's very, yeah, there's just people may think they have like a super original idea. But I always say like, and what like it kind of taught me was, even if I think my idea is original, twist it, keep pushing it, like go past what I think is even like a good idea into like a whole new realm. I think that's one thing that's definitely helped me. Yeah.
Yeah, twisting it and pushing it sounds like a good way of, a good way of thinking about writing generally.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially when you're submitting. Cause yeah, that just like, especially if you're submitting to themed too.
Right. Right. And did you, I mean, was one of those common traits you saw, those sort of things you sort of kept seeing again and again, were they were they kind of tropes very often, or themes, or things that maybe had come out of calls? Because I know when I started reading for INTERZONE, one of the things that Andy Cox, the previous editor, mentioned was that they've been getting a lot of food stories, over the previous sort of month or so. And he said there seem to be loads of stories about food. Like maybe there'd been a competition. Like was it working on that level, or was it also structural? Was it sort of just sort of stories that kind of seem to have the sort of same, starting with the same beats?
Yeah, I think the reason why it happens a lot, like you start kind of noticing it, especially when you're like reading for a magazine that gets like thousands of submissions, you just read through hundreds and hundreds of stories. And after a while, you're like, oh my God, like I'm pretty sure I've read this same story like 20 times. And then you go through and you realize you have like these things are just coming up just because you have a larger sampling pool. But I think what happens a lot is also the anthology open calls. Like you can usually tell when an anthology open call has like just closed, all of the like rejections and acceptances have gone out. And then next thing you know, you get all of these like, I think for a while we had like a lot of mermaid stories.
Yeah, I was getting mermaid stories for a while.
Yeah, there's like and you can kind of, go back and track and be like, all right, well, who like just closed up and sent out all of their notices and
Hmm.
see that, yeah,
Yeah.
people just submit. And I get it. I do the same thing. If something doesn't work, you find a new home for it. That's just the cycle of being a writer. Um, but I also think that like some of the commonalities are like thematic. Like someone will tackle a story idea that may be like really interesting and unique and original, but they won't do it in a way that's nuanced. So it's like they just had that really great idea, but about 10 other people had that great idea and then just wrote the first story that came to mind. And so it follows the very same, yeah, thinking framework in a lot of ways. It'll be like, oh, what's this? I'm trying to think of like a couple ones that come through. A lot of times we get things that deal with like parenting
Hmm.
and like monstrous children and like what to do or like what they do. And it kind of always follows like very similar structures.
Hmm. Hmm.
But the ones that step out of those are the ones that are like, oh, yeah.
Now that's fascinating. And what about the, in terms of the editing then, and I suppose the sort of the editing your own work as well. Are you just sort of on the lookout for things in your own work and in the work that you get at Strange Horizons, and just sort of in a very very sort of different way, because you have that kind of what is it, 6 or 7 or 8 years of reading? Does that really sort of change the way you look at your writing?
I think it has. And it changes like how I look at my writing and also my writing processes. Like I used to be a very fast drafter. And that worked really well for a while and it produced a lot of stories. But as of late, I've been trying to slow down and kind of probe my stories even further. And just, yeah, kind of see where they can go, not only on the line level, but like, yeah, on the themes and the ideas and the symbols that come up. And then as an editor, it comes up with like, yeah, kind of what stories I'm looking for and like what stories or what I want those stories to do or what I'm hoping that those stories can do. Like every time we open up to submissions, we'll usually talk about, hey, like what are some themes you're looking for? Like what should we specifically be looking for in the slush, the pull out?
Hmm.
And a lot of times, those things will change or they'll stay the same. It's like, oh, always diverse. Like we're always looking for that type of stuff. But when it comes to the themes and how the structures work, yeah, I can tell that over time they just kind of, yeah, I want to see not darker, but stories that go a little bit further.
Hmm. Hmm. What about you? Your kind of influences, the writers that when you started writing, or when you're writing now, that you kind of have in mind, maybe not as sort of direct influences, but that you kind of look to for a sort of inspiration.
When I first started out, I think a lot of my influences were. Dorothy Parker. I spent a lot of time reading Dorothy Parker poems and Dorothy Parker fiction. I just love Dorothy Parker. And that was just me in my 20s, being a 20-year-old. And after that, I just kind of went through, because I worked at a bookstore and I worked in the book department at Goodwill when I started kind of writing. Um, and so I kind of just went and I just started picking up books and just grabbing anything that was interesting to me. And that kind of got me introduced to a lot of different writers. And I started getting really into Joyce Carol Oates
Oh, okay.
because she felt kind of like a darker Dorothy Parker. Like she still had the same sarcasm. She still has like the same like strong female characters and the strong women characters that I really like.
Mm-hmm.
But just like, yeah, Joyce Carol's works just goes so much further and so much in a different dark realm.
Mm-hmm.
And I started getting really into that type of, yeah, literary writing that bordered on like horror or fantasy and stuff like that. And then I started falling into like Ray Bradbury and I started really loving his stuff. And I still do. But I think now my influences are definitely more like Stephen Graham Jones is a huge influence. I just went through a little bit of doing some copy work on Mongrels for a while. That was fun.
Okay.
I don't know if you've done copy work or want me to get into what that is.
I left it hang there and I was, yes, go into copy work. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, copy work is just picking a text and then rewriting it word for word. A lot of times people will say do it by hand, but I like to type it up on my Alpha Smart because I really love deleting the file at the end. It's very
Oh,
therapeutic for me to like write a bunch of text and then just delete. But the purpose is to kind of ingest the writing and the style and get a sense of how the author goes about building certain scenes or characters. And you can use it to pinpoint like specific techniques you want to learn. Like if you're trying to learn how to write a fight scene, like find a good fight scene and rewrite it. Like just write the exact same words and figure out what the writer did line by line to make that scene work.
okay.
And so, yeah, that's what I did with Mongrels. I kind of just went through it because I really love the way that Stephen Graham Jones builds like family dynamics in that. And if you've never read Mongrels, it's a coming of age werewolf story. Yeah, and it's really good. It's real good. It's dark and
That
emotional.
kind of sells itself.
All the things you want from a Stephen Graham Jones book. Yeah. Yeah, right now I want to say I think a lot of my influences are that. I've been really getting into of course I'm blanking on authors. I'm trying to look at my bookshelves to see like, yeah, what like stands out as influences, but honestly, it's just like whatever catches my eye. I really love The Reformatory. I just read that. And that I feel like has changed how I view writing about tough subjects. Like it's totally
Okay.
reshaped my mind. And I love that.
The copywriting is really intriguing. I had a feeling that it was something to do with this. I wondered if it was, like layering something on top. But when you started describing it, it reminded me of I forget where I saw it. I think it was a documentary, but it was Hunter S. Thompson had
Mm-hmm.
apparently. You've heard the story. It sort of typed out The Great Gatsby, I think, multiple times just to sort of.
Yeah, I think he also does the Bible or did the Bible.
Did you do the Bible as well? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's it's such a fascinating process to sort of sit down and do that. And you do it on an Alpha, right? One of these little kind of disconnected typing devices. Is that right?
Yeah, that just has like a little screen. It's just because like, with that type of copy work, I didn't want to put it into a document and actually dig into it. I just wanted to kind of write it through, examine it, and then keep going, and then delete it when I was done. I think Hunter S. Thompson did a typewriter.
I think so. I think that was this. Yeah, I remember it being, which it also just seemed to be so sort of labor intensive. Like you really would, you mentioned sort of, really sort of ingesting it. That's that's like muscle memory, ingestion. That's everything when you do it, when you're actually hearing the typewriter and taking a whole book. But no, that's, I can imagine you take the rhythm as well. The rhythm kind of comes through.
Yeah, the rhythm. I've heard some people say that they used it for figuring out voice, like character voice and their own voice as well.
You mentioned that well, I know you've written poetry as well. You write poetry as well, I think. How do those different sort of parts of your writing brain connect, the sort of the prose writer and the poetry writer?
I think I just like kind of like tried to touch base with him, like, how do y'all, connect? Do you talk? Do you wrestle? What is it? And it was just like, we don't. But that's not true because I can tell that like both sides come up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think since poetry was the first thing I started writing, and I kind of always feel like that's like my first sort of language, like my first literary language was poetry, that I see that come up way more in my fiction. Like, yeah, my writing tends to be a little bit more evocative and have the flow or the feeling very similar to my poems.
Mm-hmm.
And now when I like sit down and I write poems, I can tell that the narrative structure of a fiction is there. There's more story and less feelings.
Okay.
Yeah, and so like they kind of take from each other where one gives voice and the other gives structure.
That's a lovely way of putting it. You're also you write a lot of craft articles. You're very involved in a lot of sort of helping other writers to write better. When did that start, and where can listeners find that part of your work?
I think that started around the same time I started kind of just doing reviews on my blogs. Yeah, I was just like, oh, like I have these thoughts about writing and I kind of just want to get them out. Um, and at first, it was just kind of like, yeah, me thinking about writing. But then as I got more developed and kind of researched more and dug more into craft and analyzed more fictions and like my own writing, I got my craft articles became less like, I wonder what this is about, and more like, oh, I see. Let me like try to help other people see. Um, and a lot of people started connecting with it more and being like, okay, this makes sense. Like the way you described it, it finally connects. I didn't get it before, but this makes sense. And I think a lot of that comes down to just the examples I use, like on my website where people can find a lot of different writing resources, because that's where I used to post a lot of my stuff. I use scenes from movies or from TV shows. I use, I think there might even be somewhere I use poems. I use like fictions. I use kind of like any form of story that I can to help get the point across to people. Because a lot of times someone might not understand a fiction narrative and how it breaks down a beat. But like if they see it in a visual format, they'll be like, oh, I see. This makes sense now.
Okay.
And so I started there. And then I have a lot, I think I've been writing for Writer's Digest for the past 2 years. So I have a lot of articles and past issues of those. And I have some articles coming up in next year's issues as well on voice exercises. Um, but yeah, I feel like I've been writing about writing for about maybe half the time since I've been writing. So for a few years now. And it also helps just to have I have like a really, what's a good word for it? I have a really dedicated writing community that is like here where I live. And they're really great. We meet like every week and we have workshops. And it's great to have other writers to talk to about craft and kind of get feedback on, how to discuss certain techniques in a way that everyone can understand them. Because a lot of times,
Mm-hmm.
especially when I was starting out, I would like come across a technique and be like, I don't really understand this. And then someone would try to tell me in a way that just didn't work for my brain. Like I would just be like, it would be that like, that meme where like someone's staring and there's all those equations happening. That would be me when someone was explaining craft to me.
Right.
And so like working with different writers has helped me figure out, yeah, that everyone kind of learns differently and what different ways to kind of like teach people and talk about craft and do exercises in a way that helps people learn.
Right. That sounds, and the name of that is it South Sound Speculative Fiction? Is that right?
Yes, the South Sound Speculative Fiction group. That's the writing group, and if anyone like looks it up, it'll take them to our Reddit, and that's where we post all of our workshops, so people can use those workshops, and they have resources, and they're all focused on different craft techniques. And I put those together with feedback from the group, and so that's like another place people can go to get some craft resources if like they're trying to learn. Our most recent one was food world building and how to use food to world build.
Oh.
And so we have a bunch of resources on that up there. Yeah.
When you mentioned the sort of the importance of the writing community and with your own writing, is there a point where you feel ready to share it, or is that right at the beginning, or are you sort of not so much solitary, but are you kind of writing for yourself initially and then you reach a point where you want to sort of take it to the group?
It's definitely the right for myself and my imagined reader who's like sitting in the car with me and we're going on this wild ride together. And then once that's all out, then yeah, I usually take it through one or two edits and get it reader ready. Which for the group that I take it to, we don't demand it be like, grammatically correct because we're not doing line edits on a story. So like I try to make it readable, but there's going to be typos and things like that. But I try to get it to a point where I think my message is coming across. Like if I'm at that point where I'm like, yeah, everything is the exact way I think it should be, and I think people should be able to pick up on this, like pick up on XYZ, whether it's like the emotion I'm trying to create or the action that's happening in a scene.
Mm-hmm.
And the way we function with our critique group, you have to give focus points. So you have to give like the critiquers like what you want them to kind of focus on and give you pointers on. And that's always helpful. Because if I'm at a point where I'm like, all right, I want to share this, but I have literally no idea what I want people to focus on, I can tell that I'm not really ready to share it at that point, because if I'm like, oh well, like it's perfect, like there's nothing that can change in this, right? That's just never true.
Right. Okay.
Like if I'm thinking that, I'm already wrong. So I usually will like wait until I'm at a point where I have actual things that I want to solve with the story, where I'm like, okay, like, this is really good, but I need to make sure that I'm saying what I think I'm saying and it's coming across the way I want it to another person.
Right. And your INTERZONE 295 story building blocks, what was the message? What was the message you had in mind when you started writing that, or what was the sort of the first brick, I suppose, in getting to that story?
Yeah, I wanted to say woot because I'm so excited to, work with you.
It's good.
INTERZONE. It's so exciting, just very, very exciting. We'll never stop wooting about it. But for that story, honestly, I wanted to write a day in a life, kind of like a longer vignette. The way I've described it to some writing friends, is all vibes in like a fantasy world. Like I really wanted to capture a character's feelings and emotions through like a day in their life,
Mm-hmm.
that actively made people care, even if there wasn't conflict or like things exploding or all of this crazy stuff happening. It was just they cared about this character and the other characters and what was happening in this world. And it was just interesting enough as it was. That was like my main goal for that story.
Yeah, and you did that. No, exactly. I mean, the vibes for sure, and that sort of, yeah, that sort of the sort of the strong, my own sort of strong feeling for the character, but without there needing to, as you say, without there needing to be anything, grand or, it's a you mentioned it's like an expanded vignette, and that's an interesting kind of way of thinking of it as well. But it is a very, it's doing a lot in a very sort of quiet way, which I think is often, going back to sort of reading submissions. I think sometimes you read like stories that are trying from, out of the gate to do so much so quickly and to have so much story. And that's definitely what drew me to it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I was playing with was like I like the idea of the cool world that verse lived in, and how yeah there was magical home construction. I was like, that's awesome, and people live on the moon. That's cool. And I was like, but there's no fighting. There's no like all of this evil. There's no huge stakes. We're just gonna hang out with verse, and we're just gonna be with them while they work. Like that's it. It's just a day with this really cool person.
And how I mean, do you remember how your writing group sort of worked on that story with you? Was there what was that, were there any insights you gained there that you can remember now or not?
Yeah, the writing group and the people in it at the time, when I was trying to tell them what I was going for, they gave me a lot of points on like what stakes felt like were naturally coming out of the story, and how because of the way a lot of American readers are when they go into a story, they're going to be looking for stakes and they're looking for conflict. And I was like, no, 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 but I don't really want like all of that. Like, I just kind of want like this person in their life, like, and I just want to go through that, and I want to like go into their emotions and like what they're feeling. Um, but and I don't want to give too much away about the story, but there is conflict that comes up. And they gave me some pointers on how to make the conflict that does come up not be so overarching that that becomes the part of the story that becomes like the main issue of the story. Is like, okay, so this isn't a story about verse, this is a story about like verse and this conflict they're having at work, when that's not what I wanted. I wanted a story that's like literally just about this person, the work they do and the passion they have and the feelings they have for home.
Oh, that's great. I think that, to me, that sounds like a great example of where you need to have that clear idea in your mind, and then sort of stick to your guns and stick to that kind of the vision of what you have for the story. And with the right community, the right kind of people, that will they'll help you get that out. So that's a really sort of positive example.
Yeah, and you're so right. Yeah, the wrong communities can definitely kind of hinder a story and even like hurt a writer's voice or even their belief in what they want to do with the story.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever? I mean, obviously, I guess it's a tricky question, but have you ever sort of received the sort of feedback that you do feel compromises that, and has it been easy to push back against it? Because I think there is always that question, isn't there? Of you have an editor or you have a reader who sort of comes with something, and you just know it's not the right thing. But for a writer who's starting out, it's sometimes difficult to differentiate between the good advice and the advice that maybe isn't right for that story and that writer.
Yeah, that has happened to me. To one of my first stories that I ever wrote when I was like, okay, I'm going to be a professional speculative fiction author. That's what I'll do. Like,
Mm-hmm.
mindset on it, gonna get to work. And I wrote a story right after reading a bunch of Samuel R. Delany books, who is another like big influence on my writing. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to write this like really weird story about trauma monsters on this island. And when I first shared it with my writing group, it was like, everyone was like, this is not good. Like,
Okay.
this is a really bad story. They tore it apart. And this was a writing group from like way before the one I'm in now. Like, I want to say I was in this writing group when I was in my like early 20s. I think at the time we called it like Little Darlings or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. It was like, yeah, it was just like nothing was good about it. And I remember thinking, they don't get it. Like, that was kind of a thought. I was like, I know that this story has heart and I know it's there and it's got something to it. They just don't get it. And so I was like, I won't continue sharing it. And I kind of just continued working on it. And then I shared it again with another writing group. And they also said that it wasn't good. And they were like, this is a bad story. This is bullshit. You're doing too many things that you shouldn't be doing. And I was still like, I'm pretty sure they don't get it.
Oh,
Like,
wow. Okay.
I know what I'm doing here. I trust in like my abilities and in my idea for this story. And so like, I just kept working on it and kept working on it. And by the third time I shared it with the group, and at this point it was with the South Sound Speculative Fiction Writers Group, the people in it, and one of the people was someone who saw the earlier version, they were now getting it. They were starting to see like the themes were starting to come out. And while some things were really confusing, and it was all related to character motivation and kind of world logic, it was starting to kind of get closer to like the final finish.
Wow.
And
Okay.
yeah, and so like I ended up selling that story to the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. And it took like 5 or 6 years to kind of get up to like the point where it was able to go out on submission. But a lot of it was just like belief in the story and holding really tight to my idea for what I wanted the story to talk about and to kind of go over. Um, and I think if I didn't have like that hard belief in like my themes and how I wanted them to show up on the page, I probably would have listened to everyone who said the story was like, bad. If I would have been like, you know what, you're right. I don't really know what this story is doing. I don't know why I'm here. I'll just toss it.
Oh, that's a wonderful story. And as soon as you mentioned trauma and islands, I was thinking that's the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction story. I think I wonder if I was thinking, is this story going in a wonderful direction? And it was. So
yeah. I feel like if I ever mention like trauma monsters and islands, I think most people in my life will be like, I know what you're talking about. It's that one story. Yeah,
that's great. So have that. You have faith in it, and keep on going. Moving on to you said you told me in an email that you're working on a dark fantasy. Is it a dark fantasy novella? Yeah, I'm checking my notes. So you're working on a dark fantasy novella. Can you tell us anything more about that?
Sorry, oof, I had a burp. You don't have to edit that out. Everyone burps. So that is God, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. It is a modern epistolary novel or novella about a elderly woman who finds a baby in the snow, but the baby is a strange creature that eats inanimate objects and ages rapidly based on emotions and desire and wants. And it's about their relationship with their town as the town is going through a major development.
Okay.
Hopefully I will have something out for people to read on that soon. I was quarrying it, but no one picked it up. So I plan on serializing it or self-publishing it because it's a fun, wild ride.
Oh, that sounds great. You self-publish your poetry, I think, don't you? Directly off the site, or am I misremembering? I feel like I've seen something of yours self-pubbed.
Yeah. I have a couple of self-published titles. I have a self-published short story collection and a self-published poetry collection that, yeah, are available through my site and through Barnes and Noble. Um, and I think like a couple of indie bookstores. Like I know like it's available through my local indie bookstore. But yeah, I sometimes will self-publish titles.
I mean, do you feel that now with the sort of the sort of this the short fiction, the sort of short fiction mags going through so many changes, and they're, it's so hard to kind of find sometimes the right home for things. Do you think that, serialization, newsletters, self pubbing in this way, do you think this is a sort of a way, it's something we're going to see a lot more of? Because there are sort of, there are so many people writing, and there are so many stories that, want to need to be out there. Is that something you're kind of actively pursuing?
Um, I am actively pursuing it, but I think kind of to that, for me, I think that there are so many publications out there, and a lot of times we can get in the mindset that there's not. Um, but there are like hundreds, and like some are starting like even now, like today, like there are some that are reopening. Like I think there's a lot of places out there for short stories. And I think there's a lot of venues. I don't think there's a lot for longer short stories. So for novelettes and novellas,
Mm.
those there's not a lot of publications that publish those. So for those, I do see that there is a huge opportunity for people to do self-publishing.
Hmm. And serialization is a nice is a nice approach as well. Particularly, I think, with the way, people. I'm seeing more sort of, more regular or semi-regular newsletters that have stories, or that have, narratives and things in them, which I think are, yeah, that's definitely something appealing. I can see the appeal of that.
Yeah, and I always really love the idea of serializing something, and I've always wanted to either on my blog or in a newsletter. I think it's that like romantic writer idea of like, oh yes, I send out like a chapter of a story, like Charles Dickens. I don't know, there's something magical about it. And I'm like, at one point in my career, I like need to serialize a novel. Um,
Mm,
and what better one to do than one that's made of journal entries, emails, and text messages and things like that. That type of
yeah,
format, the epistolary one, just makes it really easy to serialize.
that's great. And it- you also said you're researching a horror thriller, and I maybe you can sort of, maybe that's sort of at an earlier stage, so it's harder to talk about. But I wonder, yeah, can you talk about it? And also, when it comes to horror and dark fantasy, and your sort of approach to genre generally, do you have an approach to genre? Are you thinking in terms of genres with your writing, or do the sort of do the boundaries blur? Do they kind of come together at certain points?
Um, that's such a good question. I think when I'm writing and it's like first drafting and it's just me and my imaginary reader, we're hanging out in that car and we're driving.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think about genre. I think I'm just writing and I'm trying to tell a good story and trying to keep them entertained. But as I sort of get more into like the editorial thinking, the editorial side of things of like, all right, how do I categorize this? Like, who is my reader though? Where does my reader go in a bookstore? Where would they like,
Mm-hmm.
if they were explaining this to someone else, like how would they describe it? And then genre starts coming in more. Uh, and for the horror thriller that I'm researching right now, I think the most I can say about it is that it's it's really dark, and I'm kind of working through the outline and a lot of research into addiction and harm reduction, and just the impact that it's had on America throughout history and even now, but also digging into some true crime stuff,
Mm.
world building things, and it's all just creating this bubbly mash of dark horror
Mm.
stuff. Yeah. Yeah, it's so hard to like really, yeah, talk about it at such a stage where like, yeah, I'm still changing things like character names. But yeah, what I'm looking into, it's like, yeah, trying to tell a story about, I love writing about home and just the different themes related to home and our connection to home. And so this is another one that's going to be about home. And so I'm trying to kind of figure out how to write about our responsibilities to home,
Mm.
and how our or not, yeah, how our approaches to handling some of the policies and social reactions, taboos related to drug use and addiction,
Mm.
and how closely related to religion and belief and salvation
Mm.
all of it is. And kind of, yeah, just trying to examine that.
Wow, that's a lot. That also sounds really really interesting. So
Yeah, I'm having fun. It's really working my brain.
you mentioned sort of true crime and horror, and the book that jumped to mind was David Demchuk's Red X. I don't know if you've seen that one yet, but he kind of wrote a great sort of horror novel, which is, yeah, you know, blending sort of, you know, all sorts of, you know, darker parts of reality, you know, all sorts of truths, and also, you know, being a horror novel. I think that's a really kind of fascinating approach to all sorts of themes, but particularly, you know, themes to do with, you know, social themes in particular, for sure.
Yeah, thank you for that recommendation. I wrote it down. I will be looking into it.
What about your kind of your reading at the moment? Is there anything you'd like to signal boost or recommend? Anything that's been sort of on your radar?
Yeah, let me pull up my story graph. I'm also going to boost story graph. Everyone should get it. It's
Okay.
really great. It's a reading tracking app and a book tracking app. But I'm so bad at remembering like the books I'm reading when I read them, so I have to have like some sort of way of tracking everything. Um, but yeah, I've mentioned it earlier, but the Reformatory is coming out by Tyrannery Dew, and I believe it's coming out Halloween.
Oh, okay.
Uh, yeah, I think it's coming out Halloween 2023, so in a couple of weeks. And that's horror historical fiction, and it blends the realities of the Jim Crow South with horror elements in such a way that's like terrifying and heartbreaking. And I love that. That's if you can be scary and make me cry all at the same time,
Wow. Okay.
you've won me over. It's such a good book. So I'm just going to keep shouting about that forever. I want everyone to read it. It's so great. Um, and Vampires of El Norte, that's another great one. And that one is by Isabella Cananes, I think is how you pronounce her last name. But if I'm mispronouncing it, I'm super sorry.
Okay.
But Vampires of El Norte, that is, I think it just came out last month in September. And that is a really interesting vampire book that blends kind of like Western novels and like Western romances with vampire themes.
Ah.
And it's really entertaining and like a very quick read. It's like that kind of like really good pacing. You kind of like blow through it really quickly just because it's so exciting.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I just finished Stephen Graham Jones After the People Lights Have Gone Off, and that's one of his short story collections. Um, and I really like it because I feel like in those stories, it was really good quiet horror. It was really good, like, yeah, unsettling type of dread.
Hmm.
Uh, which I think is kind of hard to do for a lot of writers. Some people, especially writing horror, tend to lean to like, yeah, let me just like freak people out and throw all of these dark things. But that's not really what this book does. And I love that. But yeah, I have read a couple of other books, nonfiction ones that are also really great. But I won't get into those because I read so many books and I listen to so many audiobooks. But yeah, those three I think are really great and people should check out. Vampires of El Norte, The Reformatory, and After the People Lights Have Gone Off.
Thank you very much. Those are great. You said you listen to audiobooks and as well as reading. What's the criteria? Because I listen to a lot of audiobooks and I tend to do it probably partly when I'm trying to relax more, and when I'm sort of I just want to kind of, just let something, just be on in the background, and I might kind of come in and out of it, and I might sometimes, go back and listen again. Do you find that you take to certain audiobooks more than others, either because of the content or the reader?
No, I think it's more based on what I'm reading the book for. So if I'm reading it for like doing a review for Lightspeed, I always try to have a physical copy or an e-reader so that I can take notes and kind of like write little side things at certain moments. And that's super hard to do with audiobooks. Even though I know there's a way to do it, I just don't like it as much as like a physical copy and like writing out a note of like what I'm thinking or feeling in a moment. Um, so yeah, if it's a research book, I can do an audiobook because it's like I can quickly write down a quick note that I hear. If it's a passion book or like I really love listening to history audiobooks. So like I usually tend to listen to a lot of history audiobooks or like music theory books or stuff like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think recently it's mainly been like research books, some history books and science books. Um, and yeah,
Okay.
whatever I can get my hands on at my library.
Ah, okay. Well, that's all great. So you can read, listeners, you can find building blocks in INTERZONE 295 at interzone.press. Please do get a copy if you haven't already. And you can read stories that you've edited in Strange Horizons, reviews you've written in Lightspeed. You have the Writing Craft newsletter, which I get through and which is always full of interesting things. Anything else we should mention before I go?
I have a really active author blog, and it's AignerLWilson.com. And if you also just like look me up, you'll find all of my writing everywhere.
It's easy to find.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on, Aigner. And I hopefully we can talk again when maybe the novella or the novel is out. That sounds awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it.